Hello everyone, here is Afra Siab. Today we are going to solve Cambridge IGCSE Physics Paper 4 Theory Extended, held on May June 2018 and paper code is 0625 with variant 41. So let's start from question number 1. Question number 1. Figure 1.1 shows the speed time graph for a vehicle accelerating from rest. So the vehicle is accelerating from rest. It means that its initial velocity is equal to 0 and then its speed goes on increasing with time. Part A. Calculate the acceleration of vehicle at time t is equal to 30 seconds. Here we have to find out the acceleration of vehicle. On figure 1.1 we can see that it's a speed time graph. The speed is measured in meter per second and it is taken along y-axis, while the time is measured in second and it is taken along x-axis. So we have to find out the value of acceleration at time t is equal to 30. So first of all, 30 comes at this point. I write here 30. So we know that the slope of speed time graph gives us acceleration. For that we have to find out the slope of speed time graph. And when we have to find out the speed time graph and when we have to find out the slope, I use a ruler and join this point on the curve. It will meet at this point. But here we can see that this curve is not a straight. It is bending. So we have to take 2 points. First of all, we have to draw the tangent. So I will draw a tangent line at that point. So this tangent line touches the 2 point at this point and second one is this point. We find out the coordinates of these 2 points. So here we can see that time is 0 and speed is 4. So this point is basically 0 and 4. While this point speed is 30 and time value is 72. So the point will be 72 and 30. So when we have to find out the slope, I write here acceleration is equal to slope of speed time graph and it will be v2 minus v1 over t2 minus t1. If I consider this as first point and this as second point. So first of all, it is t and v. So v1 is 4 while the v2 is 30. So I write here 30 minus 4 divided by. Time is 72 and 0. So it will be 72 minus 0. Acceleration comes to be 26 divided by 72. So it comes to be 0.36 meter per second square. So this is the value of acceleration at time t is equal to 30 seconds. I write here 0.36 meter per second square. Going towards the next part B. Without further calculation, state how the acceleration at time 100 seconds compares to the acceleration at time 10 seconds. Suggest in terms of force a reason why any change has taken place. So going back to the figure. First of all, here we choose 10 seconds. it is at this point and 100 second is at this point. So I'm going to label at this point, and this is when I draw a tangent at both of these points. It will be just like this, and on this point the tangent line will be this. Now by comparing both of these, we can see that at t is equal to 10 seconds, the tangent is very steep, while at t is equal to 100 seconds, it is less steep. I write here t is equal to 10 seconds and t is equal to 100 seconds. Here it is very steep, small, steep. You can see that it's almost constant and it's just a straight line. At t is equal to 10 seconds, as it is a steep, so here acceleration value will be large. But at t is equal to 100 seconds, acceleration will be small. So I write here acceleration is less at t is equal to 100 seconds. And as the speed increases, we also have to define in terms of force. That's why I'm writing as speed increases, then the force due to air resistance also increase. So the total net resultant force decrease, because I write here total resultant force is equal to the force due to engine minus the force due to air resistance. So as the air resistance force increases, so that the net resultant force decrease, I write here as F resultant is equal to F engine minus force due to air resistance, so that resultant force decreases. Because here we can see that air resistance force increases and net force is the difference of force due to the engine and force due to air resistance, so that the net force decrease. And so does the acceleration decrease, because F is equal to ma. Part C. Determine the distance travelled by the vehicle between time is equal to 120 seconds and time is equal to 160 seconds. Here we have to find out the distance travelled by the vehicle. So first of all, time is 120 seconds and second time is 160 seconds, and this is given by this curve. So here we have to find out the total distance travel, and it will be equal to the area under this curve. So first of all, I use a ruler and join it with x-axis. So we have to find out the area under this curve. I also divide this section into two parts so that one becomes rectangle and other is triangle. So we can see here it's a triangle region and below here is a rectangular region. I label them as 1 and 2. It means that we have to find out the area of this rectangle and the area of this triangle. So I just write here, at this point speed is 20 meter per second and at this point it is 30 meter per second. So when we have to find out the area of this region 1, I just write 1 over 2 multiply by base and height. Here base is 160 minus 120. It is equal to 40 multiply by the difference between these 2 points. It is 30 and 20. So 30 minus 20 is equal to 10. So this is basically the area of triangle. Next we have to find out for the region 2. It will be equal to 160 minus 120, that is 40 multiply by, here it is 20 and at this point it is 0. So just multiply it with 20 and add both of these to find out the area under the given curve. So I write here distance travel is equal to area under graph, and it is equal to area 1 plus area 2. Area 1 is actually triangular region, so it will be 1 over 2 multiplied by 10 and 40 plus, for rectangular region it will be 20 multiplied by 40, so that the total distance travel comes to be 1000 meter. I write here distance is equal to 1000 meters. Figure shows a forklift truck lifting a box. Here is a figure 2.1. The electric motor that drives the lifting mechanism is powered by batteries. Part 1. A. State the form of energy stored in batteries. So here we have to describe that in which form the energy is stored in the batteries. So the energy stored is in the form of chemical energy. So I write here is chemical energy. Part B. The lifting mechanism raises a box of mass 32 kg to a vertical distance of 2.5 meter in 5.4 seconds. Part 1. Calculate the gravitational potential energy gained by the box. So here mass, distance and time is given and we have to find out the gravitational potential energy. So first of all, potential energy is the energy that is possessed by a body due to height. And I write here gravitational potential energy is equal to product of mass, acceleration due to gravity and height or distance. So here we have to find out the gravitational potential energy where mass is given 32 kg multiplied by value of g is 10 and height that is distance will be 2.5. So that the gravitational potential energy comes to be 800 joule. The unit of energy is joule. So I write here gravitational potential energy is equal to 800 joule. Part 2. The efficiency of lifting mechanism is 0.65, that is 65%. Calculate the input power to lifting mechanism. Here we have to find out the value of input power. So efficiency is given and we have to find out the value of input power. So far this we know that efficiency is equal to useful work. Here power is taken, so it will be useful power. divided by input power. I write it as P naught and input power with Pi. So we have to find out the value of input power. So Pi will be equal to P naught over E. So P naught is actually the useful work, and we have to find out the value of this work. We can see here that the gravitational potential energy is equal to 800 joule. So the power will be equal to rate of doing work. From that we can calculate power. So power P naught will be equal to energy over time. Energy here is 800 divided by time is given, that is 5.4 seconds. So I write here 5.4. So that the value of power comes to be 148 watt. This is the output power. So I put values here, and it comes to be 148 divided by efficiency is 0.65. And the input power comes to be 228 watt, and it is approximately equal to 230 watt. So I write here input power is equal to 230 watt. Part C. The batteries are recharged from a main voltage supply that is generated in an oil-fired power station. By comparison with a wind farm, state one advantage and disadvantage of running a power station using oil. So first of all, we know that oil is available always, and the second it is a reliable energy input. So I write here reliable energy input. And its second advantage is always available. The disadvantage is that it is not renewable, that it cannot be used again and again. So it's non-renewable. And second one is that it causes global warming. Question number 3. A rectangular container has a base of dimensions 0.12 and 0.16 meters. The container is filled with a liquid. The mass of liquid in the container is 4.8 kilogram. Part A. Calculate first the weight of the liquid in the container. Here we have to find out the value of weight, and we are given mass and the dimension of rectangular container. So I just write that weight is the product of mass and acceleration due to gravity. Here we have to find out the value of weight. So I just put values. Mass is given 4.8 kg. It is 4.8 multiplied by the value of g is 10 meter per second square. So the weight comes to be 48, and the unit of weight is Newton. So the weight will be equal to 48 Newton. Part 2. The pressure due to the liquid on the base of container. Here we have to find out the value of pressure, and we know that pressure is force per unit area. I write here pressure is equal to force over area, or I just write F over A. So here area is given, that is 0.12 meter and 0.16 meter, and force in this case will be equal to weight. So I write here weight over A, and it is 48 divided by 0.12 and 0.16, so that the pressure comes to be 2500 Pascal or 2500 Newton per meter square. So pressure will be equal to 2500 Pascal. Part B. Explain why the total pressure on the base of container is greater than the value calculated in A. Part 2. So here we have to calculate the value of pressure, and it is 25 Pascal, and this is a pressure that is due to the liquid. But the total pressure is the sum of liquid pressure plus atmospheric pressure. I write here total pressure is equal to atmospheric pressure plus liquid pressure. So in part 2 we just consider the pressure due to liquid, but the total pressure will always be greater than, because total pressure contains the pressure due to the liquid and atmospheric pressure. So I just write here because there is also the atmospheric pressure. Part C. The depth of the liquid in container is 0.32 meter. Calculate the density of liquid. Here we have to find out the density, and we know that density is mass per unit volume. I write here density is equal to mass over volume, or I can write it as rho is equal to m over v, where mass is given and it is equal to 4.8 kilogram. So I write here 4.8 divided by volume is not given, and we have to find out the volume. So volume will be equal to the depth 0.32 multiplied by area, that is given 0.12 meter multiplied by 0.16. So it will be 0.12 multiplied by 0.16. So this is our total volume. I write here 0.32, 0.12 and 0.16. So when we do calculation, the density comes to be 780. And the unit of density is kilogram per meter cube, because mass measured in kilogram and volume measured in meter cube. So I write here kilogram per meter cube. Density will be equal to 780 kilogram per meter cube. So this is the density of liquid. Question number 4, part A. Describe the movement of molecules in part 1 solid and part 2 gases. So first of all, I consider solid and gas here. It's a solid and here is a gas. So the molecules of solid are very close to each other and there is no spacing between their molecules, while the gas molecules are very distant apart from each other and there is a large amount of spacing between the gas molecules. Here we can see that the molecules of solid are tightly packed, so they just vibrate about the fixed position. I write here molecules vibrate about fixed position. And in the case of gases, we can see here the molecules are very distant apart from each other, and these molecules move randomly at very high speed. So I write here molecules move randomly at very high speed. Part B. A closed box contains gas molecules. Explain in terms of momentum how the molecule exert a pressure on the walls of box. So first of all, I consider it's a box and it contains gas molecules. The gas molecules are very distant apart from each other, and these molecules collide with each other and also with the walls of this box. When they collide with the walls of this box, they will bounce back. It means that they change their direction. So there will be the change in momentum. I write here, first point is collide with walls, and second one is that change in momentum. So when there is change in momentum, then we know that F cross T is equal to delta P, or we can simply say that force is equal to rate of change of momentum. So there will be the force that is exerted on the molecules, and also we know that pressure is equal to force per unit area. When there is force, there will be the creation of pressure, and the molecule exert pressure on walls. So I just write here, molecules collide with the wall of box. Molecules have a change in momentum. Because when the gas molecules collide with the wall, they change their direction and bounce back. That's why there will be the change in momentum. And this exert a force on the molecules as F is equal to delta P over T. So this change in momentum exert a force on molecules and then as pressure is equal to force per unit area, molecule exert pressure on the walls of box. On walls of box. So in this case, the molecule exert pressure. Question number 5, part A. A ray of light in air is incident on a glass block. The light changes direction. State part 1. The name of this effect. So first of all, ray of light is in air and then it incident on the glass block. If I consider that it's a glass block and ray of light is incident on this block, and then I draw a normal here. When this ray comes inside of this glass block, it will bend towards the normal, just like this. So it changes its direction, and this phenomena is called refraction. So the light changes direction because of refraction. I write here part 2, the cause of this effect. So from this figure we can see that when the ray of light enters a glass block, then it will slow down. Inside this block, it slowed down. It means that its speed decreases, so that also its direction changes. So I write here light speed changes and also direction. Light changes speed and direction. Because first of all light in air and then it entered the glass, then these two mediums are different, so that there will be the change in speed and direction of this light wave. Part B. Figure 5.1, draw the full scale, show a thin converging lens of focal length 3.5 cm. So this converging lens has a focal length of 3.5 cm. Part 1. On figure 5.1, mark each of the two principal focuses and label each with letter F. So first of all we have to mark each of the two principal focus and mark them with F. So from here we can see that focal length is equal to 3.5 cm. Focal length is a distance from the center of lens to the optical focus. So first of all we have to find out the focus point, and from the center of lens we have measured distance 3.5 cm. So first of all we can see here that one small box is equal to 1 cm. It means that from this point to this point it is 1 cm, this is 2, 3 and here is 3.5 cm. I write it F. On the other side it is 1, 2, 3 and it is 3.5. So this distance is called focal length and this point is called principal focus. So this is the part first. Second part, an object O of height 4.4 cm is placed a distance of 7.5 cm from the lens. So here is the object O whose height is 4.4 cm and it is placed at a distance of 7 cm from the lens. On figure 5.1, draw rays from the tip of the object O to locate the image. Here we have to form the image. Draw and label the image. So going back to figure 5.1. So first of all here is the object and it is placed at some distance from the lens. In order to image formation, we have to know about the image, that how the image is formed. So first of all there are three rays. One ray that is parallel to the optical axis, and after refraction by this lens it passes through the focus point. Now I am going to draw this ray. So first of all I use a ruler. Now this ray is refracted by this lens and then passes through the focus point. This is ray 1. Second ray is that passing through the center of lens and goes straight forward. It does not deviate. So I am going to draw this ray. This is second ray. Third ray is that first of all it passes through the focus point, and then refraction by the lens, it becomes parallel to the optical axis. Now I am going to draw this ray. First of all, here is the focus point and this ray passes through the focus point. And here is the refraction by lens. Then it becomes parallel to the optical axis. So at this point, image will form where all the rays meet at a point. Now I am going to draw the position of image. So this is our image. I label it with I. Going towards the other part of this question. Part 3. Determine the height of the object. Here we have to describe the height of object. So going back to the figure. Here we have to find out the height of this image. And here scale is given that one small box is equal to 1 centimeter. So using this, I find out that the height of this image is 3.7 centimeter. I write here, it is 3.7 centimeter. Part 4. State and explain whether the image is real or virtual. So we can see from here that the image is real because it can be projected onto screen, and we can say that because refracted ray meet at a single point. So this is a real image. Right here real. Because it can be projected. So in this way, converging lens form the real image. Question number 6, part A. Figure 6.1 shows wave fronts approaching a gap in a barrier. Here is the figure 6.1 and we can see that these are barrier and there is a small separation between these barrier. And these wavefront are coming from left and approaching this barrier. Part 1. On figure 6.1, draw 3 wavefronts to the right of the barrier. Here we have to draw the 3 wavefront that is on the other side of barrier. So here we can see that the wavefront are coming from left to right and it is incident on the barrier. So which phenomena occur here? It is actually diffraction. I write here, it's diffraction. And how the diffraction occur? First of all, we compare the distance between these two barrier. I represent it with A with the wavelength. Wavelength is the distance between any of two wavefront. So first of all, I compare both of these. If the wavelength is comparable with the distance between barrier, so there will be more diffraction. Diffraction is just like bending of the wave. So if the distance between the barrier is larger as compared to wavelength, there will be less diffraction. So we use this concept in order to draw the wavefront on the right side of this barrier. So I am going to draw this. This is the first wavefront, second and third. We have to draw the three wavefronts on the right side of the barrier. So they will be bent into the circular shape, because here we can see that the wavelength between the wavefront is comparable with the distance between these barriers. So there will be more bending or more diffraction. Now I will draw the rays here. They will bend into the circular shape. We have to be sure that the wavelength should remain same. It means that here if distance is 1 centimeter, the distance between these waves is also 1 centimeter. The wavelength on both sides of the barrier remains same. So these are the three wavefronts that are on the right side of the barrier. Going towards the next part 2. On figure 6.2, shows the gap in a barrier increased to 5 times. Here the distance between the barrier is increased 5 times. So here we can see that in figure 6.2 the distance between the barrier is very large as compared to the wavelength. So first of all I draw here a line to show this distance. So this is the distance between the barrier and this is the wavefront lambda. Here we can see that gap between the barrier is much greater as compared to the wavelength. In this way there will be less diffraction. It means that there will be less bending. So I will draw these wavefront on the right side. Then I use a ruler. So as the distance between the barrier is much larger as compared to wavelength, the wavefront that is on the right side will be almost flat. It will be straight with the bending at the edges. So there will be small bending just like this. So these are the wavefront that is on the other side of the barrier. Going towards the next part. Part B. Describe with a labeled diagram an experiment using water waves that shows the reflection of wavefront that occur at a straight barrier. Main components, that is barrier. Second one, there will be the source for the generation of water wave and it is oscillating wooden rod. And this oscillating wooden rod is used to generate the water waves, and water will contain in a plastic tank. So we also need a tank. Now if I consider that these are the barrier here, so there is a gap between these barriers and there must be the source for the generation of water wave. So there will be oscillating wooden rod. That generates the water waves. So there will be the water waves. So these water waves are generated by the oscillating wooden rod. I write here wave generation. So all of this must be placed in a tank. So I enclose this because the water wave must be enclosed in tank. I label them as barriers. So there will also a wooden rod glued to edge. So it will be this one. And it acts as a barrier. I write here wooden rod or barrier. The water waves start passing through this barrier and comes on the right side of this barrier and then incident on this wooden rod. So I will draw again the waves that is on the other side of this barrier. So these are the incident water waves that fall on the barrier and then there will be the reflection. This wave will be reflected back. So I will draw them. They will reflect back in this direction. So in this way we can generate the refracted water waves. All of these are refracted waves, while these are incident waves. And these waves can be observed by eye or by using a video camera. I write here these waves can be observed through eye or using video camera. So in this way we generate the water wave. Question number 7, part A. State in terms of their structure why metals are good conductors of electricity. Here we have to explain that why the metals are good conductor of electricity. We know that the metals have large number of free electrons. They move randomly, due to which the conduction takes place in the metal. So just metal contains large number of free electrons. That's why metals are good conductors of electricity. I write here metals have free electrons surrounding the positively charged metal ion electron. Electron can move easily. So as the metal contains a large number of free electrons and they can be moved easily, so that it is very good conductor of electricity. Part B. A cylindrical metal wire W1 of length L and cross section area capital A has a resistance of 16 ohms. A second wire W2 having length L by 2, here length is half and cross section area 2A, is made from the same material. So here is the first wire whose length is L and cross section area is A and its resistance is 16 ohms. We have a second wire of same material whose length is half and area is double. So determine part 1, the resistance of W2. Here we have to find out the resistance of second wire. So we know the formula that R is equal to, that is resistance, rho L over A. Here rho is resistivity, L is length and A is area, that is cross section area. I write it for wire 1 and wire 2. R1 will be equal to rho L over A, because here area is A and length is L. That's why I write R1 is equal to rho L over A. For second wire, R is equal to rho L2 over A2. Here length is half, so I write rho L over 2 and area is double, it is 2A. So it comes to be rho L over 4A. Now we can see it is 1 over 4 rho L over A, and the term that is in bracket is just like R1. So I replace it with R1, R2, it is R2. It will be equal to 1 over 4 R1. So here R1 is given 16 ohms. It will be 1 over 4 into 16 and it comes to be 4 ohm. So the resistance of second wire, whose length is half and cross section area is double, has a resistance 4 ohms. I write here resistance of W2 is equal to 4 ohms. Part 2. The effective resistance of W1 and W2 when connected in parallel. So both of these wires are connected in parallel. In parallel combination, it is first wire while it is second wire. I write here W1 and it is W2. And both of these are connected in parallel and there is also power supply. So we have to find out the effective resistance in parallel combination. We know that when we have to find out the resistance, it will be equal to 1 over R, that is R equivalent, it will be equal to 1 over R1 plus 1 over R2. So here the resistance of W2 is 4 ohms, while the resistance of first wire is given, that is 16 ohms. So using this value I can write here 1 over 16 plus 1 over 4, it is equal to 1 over R. So 1 over R will be equal to 5 over 16, and from here R comes to be 16 over 5 and it is equal to 3.2 ohms. So the effective resistance when both of these are connected in parallel is equal to 3.2 ohms. Part C. The parallel pair of resistors in part B2 is connected to a battery that is made from 3 cells in series. Each of electromotive force EMF is E. There is a current in the resistor. Part 1. State the EMF of the battery. So here I just erase this. And there are 3 batteries. So I connect here 3. It is 1, 2 and 3. And each of them has EMF E. So all of these batteries are connected in series, that is given in the question. So we can see from here that when the batteries are connected in series, it will be just like this. It is positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative. It means that the positive end of one wire, positive end of one cell is attached with the negative end of the other. So there is opposite polarity. In this case, when we find out the total EMF, it will be the sum of all EMF. So here it is E. All of these has EMF E. So I just add all of these to find out the total EMF and it will be equal to 3E. I write here it is 3E. Part 2. The current in a battery is IB. The current in W1 is I1 and the current in W2 wire is I2. Place a tick in one box to indicate how these 3 currents are related. So first of all, I draw a diagram again. It is W1 and it is W2. The resistance of W1 is 16 ohms and the resistance of second wire is 4 ohms. So it is given that IB is the current of this battery and this current is I1 and here is I2. So first of all, when this current passes from positive to negative terminal of a battery, at this point it divided into two. It may come in this direction or in this direction, so that in this way it flows through the whole circuit. Now we compare the resistances. I write here wire 1 and wire 2. The resistance of wire 1 is 16 ohms and resistance of second wire is 4 ohms. Now we have to find out the value of current. So resistance is the opposition to the flow of current. We can simply say that at constant potential difference, the resistance is inversely proportional to current. So here wire 1 has larger resistance as compared to wire 2. I also write here R1 is greater than R2, so that the current passing through the wire 1 will be smaller as compared to wire 2. It is because that current is inversely proportional to resistance when the potential difference is constant. So I can simply write from here that I1 must be less than I2 because wire 1 has more resistance, that's why its current will be smaller. Now we compare this with the whole current, as the battery supplies current to both of these wires, so that the current of battery, that is IB, is much larger as compared to both of these. So I just write here order that current IB is the largest, then there is current I2 because I2 is greater than I1, so it will be I2 and it will be greater than I1. So this option is IB greater than I2 and 1. This is the correct option. Question number 8. In a laboratory at normal room temperature, 200 grams of water is poured into a beaker. A thermometer is placed in a water has a reading of 22 degrees C. Small pieces of ice at 0 degrees C are added to the water one by one. The mixture is stirred after each addition until ice has melted. The process is continued until the temperature recorded by the thermometer is 0 degrees C. First of all, temperature is 22 degrees C and then decrease and it becomes 0 degrees C. The total mass of the ice added to the water is found to be 60 grams. So this is the mass of ice that we add in water. Part A. The specific heat capacity of water is 4.2 joule per gram per degree C. Calculate the thermal energy lost by the water originally in the beaker. Here we have to find out the amount of thermal energy lost. For that, here is given the specific heat capacity of water. So using formula that E is equal to mc delta T. Here we have to find out the value of E because it is the thermal energy lost. So E will be equal to, here m is the mass of water, because here we have to find out the thermal energy lost by the water. So the water has a mass of 200 gram. I multiply 200 with C is given 4.2. As mass is given in gram and C unit is, I write here mass in gram and the unit of C is joule per gram and degree C. This gram cancels by this, so we don't convert this gram into kilogram. Multiply by change in temperature, and this temperature will be 22 and 0. So the total change in temperature will be equal to 22. but it will be minus 22 because the final temperature is 0 and initial temperature is 22. So the energy comes to be 18480 joule and it is equal to 18,000 joule. So here will be the minus sign because of this, and this minus sign shows that energy lost. So here we have to write out the thermal energy and it will be equal to and this thermal energy will be equal to 18,000 joule. Part B. Assume that all thermal energy lost by the water originally in a beaker is transferred to the ice. So all of the thermal energy that is lost by the water is transferred to the ice. Calculate the specific latent heat of fusion of ice. Here we have to find out the specific latent heat of fusion of ice. So I write here energy is equal to M and LF, where E is energy, M is mass and LF is specific latent heat of fusion. We have to solve this for ice because we have to find out the specific latent heat of fusion of ice. So it will be LF is equal to E over M, and in the part B, we assume that all the energy that is lost by the water is transferred to the ice. It means that the energy of ice will be equal to the thermal energy that is lost by the water. So I write here 18480. That is given here, this value, and divide it with the mass of ice. So mass of ice is given here, that is 60 gram. So I put here it will be equal to 60, and specific latent heat of fusion of ice comes to be 310 joule per gram. So I write here specific latent heat of fusion of ice is equal to 310 joule per gram. Part C. Suggest a reason for an inaccuracy in the values of the specific latent heat of fusion of ice calculated in Part B. Assume the temperature readings and the values for the mass of water and the mass of ice are accurate. So the temperature, mass of ice and mass of water values are accurate. So there will be the inaccuracy in the value of specific latent heat of fusion of ice. So because the thermal energy transfer from the surrounding, because thermal energy is not accurate here, it may be transferred from the surrounding. So there will be the inaccuracy in the value of specific latent heat of fusion. So I write here thermal energy transfer from surroundings. So that's why there will be the inaccuracy in the value of specific latent heat of fusion of ice. Question number 9, part A. A student wants to demagnetize a permanent bar magnet. She suggests these steps. Part 1. Place the magnet in a long coil. 2. Switch on a large alternating current in the coil. 3. Switch off the current. 4. Remove the bar from the coil. State and explain whether the steps will always be able to demagnetize the magnet. So here 4 steps are taken to demagnetize a permanent bar magnet, and we have to explain that whether the step will always be able to demagnetize the magnet. So here is a third step, switch off the current. So AC should not be switched off. AC is alternating current and it cannot be switched off, and the magnet should be removed from the coil. So first I write here no alternating current should not be switched off and the magnet should be removed from the coil, because the magnet should be alternately magnetized in different direction. Part B. Part first. Figure 9.1 shows a coil supplied with current using the split ring commutators. State and explain any motion in the coil. So in a figure 9.1 we can see that here is a battery that is connected here, and there is also split ring and carbon brushes. These are the split rings, and there is also carbon brushes. The battery is attached with the carbon brushes, and there is also a coil that is placed in the magnetic field. This magnetic field is provided by the magnet. So first of all, here we have to describe any motion in this coil. When we on this battery, current will flow through these separators, and this is positive and it is negative. Current flows from positive to negative. In this way, current flows upward, and here in this direction. From here, current will be outward direction, and then it flows in this direction. So this is the direction of current. We also know that magnetic field is from north to south. So by using the Fleming left hand rule, we find out the force on both sides. So first of all, I consider the right half, and then I draw a line here to separate left and right half. So here I consider first of all right side. Here we can see that the magnetic field that is represented by B is from north to south direction, and current is flowing from up to down in a coil. But for left side, magnetic field direction remains same, but the direction of current changes, and here it flows from down to up. So here we have to use the Fleming left hand rule. According to this, if I consider my left hand and then place forefinger, middle finger and thumb mutually perpendicular to each other, then if I point my middle finger in the direction of current and forefinger in the direction of magnetic field, then my thumb indicates the direction of force. I write here, thumb will indicate the direction of force if mid finger is in the direction of current and forefinger is in the direction of magnetic field. So by using this rule, we can see that force on the left side will be in this direction, while on the right side force will be upward. So these two forces are equal but opposite direction, and that's why the coil rotate, and the coil will rotate in clockwise direction. So I write here, coil will turn in clockwise direction. And it turns because there are two forces that are acting on the coil. Both of these are in opposite direction. So as we know that it's a alternating current, and this current changes its direction after each half. I write here, if I consider this is alternating current, and this time period is actually T. At this point, this time period is half, and we can see that at this point, after that, the current changes its direction. First of all, it is positive and then it becomes negative. It means that the current reverses direction after every half turn in the coil. So, when the position of coil changes, then the current also reverses, and this reversal of current will be just like this. So I write here, current reverses direction after every half turn in the coil, so that the coil will continue to turn clockwise. Going towards the next part 2. The coil in figure 9.1 consists of 3 turns of wire. The magnetic field strength of the magnet is M, with a current of 2.0 ampere in the coil. The coil experiences a turning effect T. The first row of table 9.1 shows this data. So first of all, here is a table 9.1. We can see that first of all here is number of turns, and then the current passing through the coil, and there is magnetic field strength and turning effect. So first of all, when number of turns is 3, then the current passing through the coil is 2 ampere, and then the magnetic field strength is M, so that the turning effect will be T. So we compare the second one with first. Here number of turns is 3, which remains same, but current is 8 ampere. It means that we have increased current by 4 times, and magnetic field strength remains same, so that the turning effect will be 4 times. I write here 4T. Now compare the third one. Here number of turns is 6, which means that we have double the number of turns, and the value of current still remains same, and also the magnetic field strength, so that the turning effect will be double because the number of turns are double. So I write here 2T. And in the last one case, number of turns is again 3 and current is 2 ampere, but here magnetization, that is magnetic field strength, is half. So the turning effect will be half, T by 2. All of these values are chosen from this. Here t is at this point and 4t is at this location, 2t here and t by 2 is here. So we have choose all of the values of turning effect from this table. Question number 10, part A. Explain why the voltage of the supply to the primary coil of the transformer must be alternating. So here we have to explain that why the voltage is alternating. So first of all, there is a transformer that is shown in figure 10.1. We can see from here that it has two coils. One is secondary coil and one is primary coil. This primary coil is and this coil is secondary coil. So when we on these 240 mains, then current passes through the primary coil and there will be the change in magnetic field, that is alternating magnetic field, and it changes in the primary coil and this primary coil is linked with the secondary coil magnetically. Due to this alternating magnetic field, also the AC induces in the secondary coil. It means that in order to induce an alternating current in the secondary coil, we need to create the alternating magnetic field in the primary coil. So I write here, we need to create alternating magnetic field in the core to induce an alternating current in secondary coil. Part B. Figure 10.1 shows a transformer. Here is a figure 10.1 and there is a transformer. There are 800 turns in primary coil of the transformer. We can see from here that these are the 8000 number of turns in the primary coil. The primary coil is connected to 240 volt main supply. A 6.0 volt lamp connected to the secondary coil operates at full brightness. Part 1. Calculate the number of turns in the secondary coil. Here we have to find out the total number of turns in the secondary coil. When primary coil number of turns are given and also the voltage across primary and secondary is given. So using formula that turn ratio is equal to the ratio of voltage, I write here Ns over Np is equal to Vs over Vp. From here we have to find out the value of Ns. It will be equal to Vs over Vp multiplied by Np. Here it is Vp. That is the voltage across primary coil. So by putting values, Ns will be equal to the voltage across secondary is equal to 6.0. It is 6.0 divided by voltage across primary is 240 multiplied by the total number of turns in primary, that is given 8000. So that the number of turns in secondary coil comes to be 200. I write here 200 turns. Part 2. The current in the lamp is 2.0 ampere. The transformer operates with 100% efficiency. Calculate the current in the primary coil. So here we have to find out the current in the primary circuit. When the current in the lamp, it means that current in the secondary is given, because we can see from here that lamp is connected across secondary coil. So that's why this is a current that is passing through secondary circle. And transformer is 100% efficient. It means that power input will be equal to output power. I write here, for transformer to be 100% efficient, input power will be equal to output power. So we know that power is the product of current and voltage. I write here, if I suppose that I1 is the current of primary coil and it is V1, it will be equal to I2 V2. So here we have to find out the current in primary circuit. It is I1. It will be equal to I2 V2 over V1. So that the value of current through the secondary is 2.0 multiplied by the voltage across secondary is 6.0 divided by the voltage across primary, it is 240 volt. So that the value of current comes to be 0.05. So this is the value of current that is passing through the primary circuit. I write here it is 0.05 ampere. Part 3. The primary circuit contains 2 ampere fuse. Calculate the maximum number of lamps identical to the lamp in part 2 that can be connected in parallel in a secondary circuit without blowing the fuse. So first of all, here we have to find out the maximum number of lamps. So it will be equal to, here 2 ampere fuse, I write 2 divided by the total current that is passing, it will be 0.05. So that the total number of lamps comes to be 40. I just write n is equal to 40. So it will be number of lamps is equal to 40 lamps. Question number 11. Radon 222 is radioactive. It can be represented as Rn with atomic number 86 and mass number 222. Part A. For a neutral atom of radon 222, state. Part 1. The number of protons. So first of all, here we have to state the number of proton in radon 222. From here we can see that atomic number is 86. And atomic number is basically the number of protons. So I just write here it is equal to P, that is number of protons. It means that the number of protons in radon 222 is 86. So it will be 86. Part 2. The number of neutrons. So the number of neutrons we have to find out. First of all, I write here mass number. It is equal to 222 and mass number is represented by A. So mass number will be equal to atomic number, that is number of protons plus number of neutrons. Mass number of any element is equal to the sum of number of protons and neutrons. So I write here atomic number is 222. It will be equal to proton number are 86 plus n. So that the number of neutrons comes to be 136. 222 minus 86. it will be 136. So I write here number of neutrons will be equal to 136. Part 3, the number of electrons. Here we have to find out the number of electrons, and it is given that radon is neutral atom. It means that the number of protons must be equal to the number of electrons. So here proton number is 86, so that the electron number will also be equal to 86. Part B, a radon-222 nucleus decays by alpha particle emission to a polonium whose symbol is PO nucleus. Complete the equation for the decay of radon-222. So first of all, radon-222 changes into polonium with the emission of alpha particle. So alpha particle is basically the helium nuclei, and it is represented by Ag, 4 and 2. So when I write it emits alpha particle Ag, 4 and 2, plus there will be polonium. I don't know the atomic number and atomic mass of the polonium, so we need to balance the atomic number and atomic mass on both sides of the arrows. I write here atomic number. On left hand side, atomic number is 86. It will be equal to, here is 2 plus, I suppose that it is x. So you have to find out the value of x. X will be equal to 86 minus 2, it will be 84. So I am going to find out the mass number now. On left hand side, mass number is 222. It will be equal to, on right hand side it is 4 plus y. So that the y value come to be 222 minus 4, it is 218. So I write here mass number is 218 while the atomic number is 84. So when we check the atomic number and atomic mass on both of the sides of arrow, it will be equal. It means that it is a complete decay for radon-222 into polonium with the emission of alpha particle. Part C, radon-222 has a half-life of 3.8 days. At a certain time, a sample contains 6.4 into 10 to the power 6 radon nuclei. Calculate the number of alpha particles emitted by the radon nucleus in the following 7.6 days. So first of all, half-life is given, which is 3.8 days. Secondly, we have to find out the number of alpha particles after 7.6 days. So first of all, we find out the total number of half-life. So I write here total number of half-life will be equal to total time, that is 6.2 divided by half-life, that is 3.8. Both of these are days, so that the answer will become 2. It means that there are total 2 half-life. So first of all, sample is initially 6.4 into 10 to the power 6. So after first half-life, initial sample remains half, so it will be 6.4 into 10 to the power 6 divided by 2. It becomes 3.2 into 10 to the power 3. After second half-life, because 2 half-life passes, it will be 3.2 into 10 to the power 3, it will be 6. Divided by 2, so that it comes to be 1.6 into 10 to the power 6 nuclei. So we have to find out the number of alpha particles emitted by the radon. It means that we have to subtract 6.4 into 10 to the power 6, that is the total number of sample, with this value. So I write here 6.4 into 10 to the power 6 minus 1.6 into 10 to the power 6. It will be equal to 4.8 into 10 to the power 6 nuclei. Data decayed nuclei. And it is also alpha particle released. It means that 4.8 into 10 to the power 6 alpha particle released. So I write here, it is 4.8 into 10 to the power 6 nuclei.